really called Kinbane, if one's used the Irish form, which is what it is, an Irish name. But, Kinbane is perfectly all right with me. In one sense, it's a typical example of the sort of strongholds that were established by different people all the way along the Antrim coast. They looked for places that were isolated enough to be forts without very much work having to be done to them. And Dunseverick is the one which is probably the oldest as far as one knows, and is a typical example, a little plateau cut off by erosion from the rest of the mainland, so it was easily defensible. And there were places to which, on the whole, you would not stay in for longer than you had to, because the actual ability to feed any number of people was limited. There's no room for much in the way of cattle or for some grain production or something in anywhere near Kinbane. It's interesting for another reason, and that is that the Clan Donald for a long time had both claim and control of the glens of Antrim. And the next tribal grouping up were the McQuillans, and they dominated the land from Ballycastle all the way up to Coleraine. Their famous fortress is Dunluce. The MacDonalds were anxious to encroach and displace, if possible, the McQuillans. But this was a very gradual process. And if you think about Ballycastle, for example, you have a monastery there which is built in the 15th century by the McQuillans to establish their presence there as much as anything else. So the MacDonalds were moving into hostile territory in their efforts to control the Antrim coastline, and this would allow them to bring in their fighting men more easily, the purpose being to supply the various warring groups in Ireland with gallaglasses or fighting men of one sort or another, and therefore as much control of the Antrim coastline as possible was required. So Kinbane is, interestingly enough, the first little encroachment into McQuillan territory. The McQuillans were sort of in a moderately friendly relationship, some of the time at least, with the English. The encroachment of the MacDonalds was seen by the English in Carrickfergus as very worrying, because it was going to shift the power balance. So the Kinbane is interesting in a whole heap of ways. It has good beaches for you to draw up your galleys, which were the means of transport that the MacDonalds used between here and Scotland. There was a little bit of room for grazing and growing a crop or two, but not much immediately beside it. Primarily, the purpose of Kinbane was to be able to escape from it back out to sea as quickly as possible and get back to, either Rathlin or mainland territory in Scotland, or the Isle, whichever way they went. The initial building of the little fortress at Kinbane seems to have happened about in the late 1540s, about 1549, and was immediately noticed by the English, and they were very agitated, because obviously it was an encroachment. You have the McQuillans still in Ballycastle, as well as further on the coast, and this is the first notch into their territory, and was going to destabilize things as far as the English were concerned in North Ulster. Therefore, within a couple of years of the building of Kinbane, an expedition is sent out. They try to attack Rathlin and are not very successful about that, and then they try to destroy other MacDonald holdings on the coast, and the first one they come to is Kinbane, and by their own accounts, this is in 1551, they demolished it and then retreated. It must have been sort of hard work getting there at that moment, and they didn't want to stay around too long, so they must have pulled down a few walls and moved off. It was no success. The MacDonald's man in the Antrim Coast was Collar. He was the senior brother of the head of the lordship, James he was called, who was the MacDonnell of Glenarm on Islay, who had a very strong claim to be the Lord of the Isles, so he was trying to improve his territory massively. And Collar came back and rebuilt it shortly after it was partially demolished, and then the English came back again, seemed to have tried to set up a couple of cannon on the headland above Kinbane and fired at it, but it wasn't a success anyway, and they abandoned this effort. So Collar used Kinbane as his personal fortress until he died in 1558. And then he was replaced by his younger brother, Sawley Boy, who didn't have so much use for Kinbane. He had other places, and he established himself at Dunanazing, which is close to Ballycastle. And so the McQuillans were pushed out of this end of their territory quite quickly. Kinbane then passed into the control of the McAllisters, who were supporters of the MacDonalds, who had been brought over from the Western Isles, along with several other families, and given little dollops of territory. Well, the McAllisters got their bit of territory around Kinbane and maintained it as a castle through one form of revolution and another until the end of the 17th century. And as far as we can tell, it was last lived in by one of the family in the 18th century, early 18th century, and after that just fell into decay. It did have another value apart from its use as a fortress, and that was a very successful salmon netting business of it, and salmon were an enormous part of the nutritional needs of the local families, particularly the MacDonalds. So that was maintained, and the netting of salmon went on until about 20 years ago off this bit of coast.